Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I'm preparing to check in on a couple of my worm bins. They're the ones that you see right down here. There are a couple of bins that I consider as twin bins. They're the bins that have my so-called original red wiggler worms living in them, as you can see from the label. The reason I consider these as twin bins is because when we launched the systems, we pretty much felt like the number of worms living in the two systems were pretty much equal. It's not always the case, but when it is, they turn into twin bins. So I think they're due for a feeding. It's been 12 days since the last check-in. So I'm going to get a glove on, get these two systems up on the bench, and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. At 269 days of age, these are definitely among my older systems that I have in service. I've got a few systems that are well beyond that. And in those systems, I'm already actively attempting to get the worms to migrate out of their castings or something along those lines. And I think there's only one other active system where I'm still considering it as an active bin where I'm trying to compost materials. I see we got a pumpkin seed over here and just one pumpkin seed over here too, oddly enough. And not sure how they snuck in here. Here's another one. I must have fed pumpkin at some point and failed to separate all the pumpkins from the, or the seeds from the pumpkin itself. At some point I assume that I'll probably be screening this material to see if I could separate any sort of large chunk materials like this that just haven't had a chance to break down yet. For the longest time now in these systems we've been feeding either very small particle size foods, and as you can imagine, I'm going to be sticking to that game plan here today by feeding worm chow and coffee only. And even when we deviated from that small particle size feeding style, we geared up the feeding to be made up of materials that would be pretty fast to break down and leave virtually no leftovers within a few weeks. I believe the only types of materials that might stick around for a little while after being placed into the worm bins were some banana peels that got placed in here perhaps 3 or 4 feedings ago. Other than that, everything else has been stuff like carrot peels and frozen leaves of cauliflower and cabbage bits and all kinds of things that are almost certain to break down pretty quickly. But still, you'll find a little chunk here and there of a material that goes way, way, way back. Like this, I can tell just from the way it feels in my hand that it's a piece of corn cob. So something like that would get easily screened out too. If we were to just leave that to continue on its own, it could take a little bit longer. But with the exception of little scraps like these little bits of corn cob and these just occasional seeds of pumpkin, the material in these bins is for the most part all finished castings. And I've been thinking that perhaps we might want to consider one of these next feedings their last, possibly even allow the systems to go through a little period of foraging, which is a period that I just allow the worms to work down any residual bits of leftover that's still in the bins and just not feed them over that period of time. Although it does almost seem to me with these two systems, other than those couple of little examples I showed you earlier of the seeds and corn cob bits, there's really not much for the worms to work on as far as leftover residual scraps of food or bedding. I mean, there's obviously things in here, little scraps of stuff that might have been laid out here as top covering, bits of newspaper, which I removed a moment ago, and other similar things, but I'm not even sure if foraging would be needed here. It does almost seem like we could possibly get these little guys geared up for migrating out of their lovely finished castings so that we can harvest their castings and get them situated in a new home somewhere else at some point in the near future. But I wasn't really going to embark on that today. There are things that we could possibly start doing to get the systems ready for that sort of activity. I've been finding that if I allow the material that the worms occupy to grow a little bit drier over time slowly, then the worms will gradually be motivated to seek out a more damp and comfortable place to be. And if I were to set up for example, a horizontal migration feeding zone for them, where there'd be a nice fresh bedding and perhaps more importantly an ample quantity of moisture, then they would certainly be highly motivated to go over there and stay there so that they could be extracted from the system, and then in effect they will have voluntarily exited exited their finished castings and paved the way for a nice harvest of their castings. So I was even thinking about possibly putting those plastic bubble wrap covers that I took off in the beginning back on in such a way that they don't really go all the way edge to edge, perhaps folding the middle section of it in and allowing some of the material on the outer edges to start drying. So maybe we'll do something along those lines. Material here in bin number 1, really nice. Pretty damp though, but still not so damp and muddy that it all sticks to my gloves and makes a big mess, luckily. That's usually a pretty good sign to me that the material is perhaps more damp than it needs to be. But it's not happening. It's not sticking to my gloves like a big muddy mess, so perhaps even though it does feel quite damp and moist, and probably a material that the worms are quite happy to be in, it's definitely not what I might consider to be overly damp. Although, you know, if it came to the point where I thought maybe I would want to screen the material, it's definitely not crumbly and flowing enough to the point where it all separates from itself easily. Even with my help, these little clumps are trying to stick together. I'm working them apart into little fragments, but still they're holding together well enough on their own with the existing moisture in here that would tell me that the material is still damp enough that the worms would probably have no interest in trying to seek out something better and exit the material on their own. So I do believe that perhaps at the end, one good thing that we could do here would be to replace the plastic coverings pretty loosely, covering perhaps only the very middle of the bins and allowing the outer edges to start drying out a bit. And then in future check-ins, we'll simply blend in that drier material out on the edges into the material elsewhere in the bin to absorb some of the moisture and then ultimately drive the overall moisture content down within both systems. So here, for example, is a little piece of leftover stem from a banana peel. Like I said, banana peel was probably last fed here 3 or 4 feedings ago, and there's still leftovers of it here. But I think that would have probably classified as possibly the slowest composting type of food that these systems have received in a long, long time. I was just curious, you know, so I started opening up the videos from the past 12 feedings. Some of the descriptions of the videos even identify the type of feeding they got in terms of it being small particle size foods, whether it was just worm chow or coffee, or perhaps even just shreds of carrot peel and stuff like that. And then even back to like the feeding that goes back 12 feedings at this point, because today's feeding is actually feeding number 24, so going back 12 feedings brings us back to a point where these systems were probably still less than 150 days old. And at this point today, they're 269 days of age. So for the longest time, the materials that these systems have been getting fed were all things that would probably leave no signs of leftovers in a fairly short period of time. Whether it was fast composting foods or just small particle size foods, these systems have definitely been getting geared up for quite some time now for harvest. So why don't we go ahead and give them the feeding that we were going to give them today, which was really just going to be a little portion of coffee that I thought I would spread out across the top surface. And like I said earlier, I've got worm chow, and we'll include some of that here too. So I don't want to go too overboard. Just figured a little bit of each, and then we would even maybe blend it in all across the top surface here. And even if we leave the outer edges uncovered, hopefully they'll still come up and nip off these food items before the material starts to dry out and become such that the worms don't even want to venture out to the edges anymore because of the drying of the material. But hopefully I've not spread it out such that I end up with just stuff that the worms haven't touched out on the outer edges. But it doesn't matter so much. The next time we come in, this stuff will just get blended in. It'll get consumed over time. So the last thing we'll pop in here is a little bit of my worm chow. This I'm not going to worry so much about blending it in. This stuff will just sort of sit out here more towards the middle, and the worms can just come up to the surface and nibble away at it. So these little scraps of paper, I figured maybe we could just try to spread some of this stuff back out across the top surface, because as the moisture does recirculate beneath the plastic, even though the plastic won't be all the way edge to edge anymore, it'll be more cinched into the middle. I do notice that the worms like nibbling on this paper when they come up for the foods that have been laid out onto the surface, because the foods, the kitchen scrap type foods, are usually a more nitrogen dense food, but stuff that you use as bedding and newspaper, leaves, things like that, those are typically more a carbon heavy type material, and the worms do sort of need both to sustain themselves. So it does seem like we put a few more pieces over onto the other system, so we'll bring these back to be fair. I mean, I had actually bought out a couple nice replacement pieces that we could put out here too, but I think there's enough left over that we can just let them have that, and that should be sufficient if they're craving any sort of a more carbon dense material. I know the bedding materials in these systems are definitely running low, because I've not added bedding to the feedings in recent times, but that's okay. Gradually, at some point, I think we're just going to be setting these guys up for migration, so they'll move out of this material, and at that point we'll set up a really nice cozy spot with a lot of fresh bedding and some ample moisture and fresh foods. And then hopefully that'll be enough to lure them out of their lovely castings so we can harvest and get them relocated. So that's it for our check-in with the original red wiggler worms, feeding number 24 going in today. And perhaps we'll wait another 12 or 14 days between the next check-in. And at that point I'll be curious to see how this material out here is drying. Hopefully by blending it in, at that point we'll start helping the system dry out. So I got a few things to take care of getting cleaned up, put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.